The Fiend Bray Wyatt was a short-lived but very intense WWE character, responsible for some glorious and truly terrible moments. Short-lived, of course, because Bray Wyatt would be fired as part of Nick Khan's cost-benefit cull and some major backstage problems. This video will cover in-depth, never-before-discussed backstage incidents, previously unknown details on Wyatt's firing and, if you stay to the end, exclusive details on Bray Wyatt's next moves within wrestling. I'm Tom Colohue, and today I'm answering the question, what happened to the Fiend Bray Wyatt? The Fiend character far predates his debut, with the WWE barely involved from the off. During Wyatt's feud with Matt Hardy, he was dunked into the lake of reincarnation, and this is the first time that WWE officials became aware of an entire Wyatt universe that Wyndham Rotunda, the man behind the mask, had been creating in his off time. Wyatt wanted the birth of The Fiend at that time. However, the WWE wanted to have the tag team with Hardy instead, so that's where the focus resulted. Wyatt is said to have had fun during his time with Matt Hardy, but the more exposure that Wyatt got to the broken universe, the more he's said to have wanted his own. WWE officials in place at the time have differing opinions on Bray at this point. The Fiend character was popular with Vince McMahon himself, but the writing team and overall creative staff are said to have immediately become uncomfortable with this character. The WWE's overall presentation did not suit the Fiend. There were very few ideal opponents outside of the Demon King, Randy Orton and potentially Aleister Black. A lot of the writing staff had been instructed for years to write a show like reality TV, and they simply weren't comfortable trying to create a universe where Wyatt played all of the characters and, more importantly, would not share his full creative vision with them. This was the biggest problem with The Fiend from the off. Wyatt was unwilling to share enough information on his character for the creative team to really build the environment for the character. From the first day to the last day, there was never a moment at which anyone other than Wyndham Rotunda himself knew the full details, and early on, this bred resentment. Without knowing the future of the character, writers were uncomfortable writing the present, and wrestlers who worked against The Fiend were very rarely aware of the part that they were expected to play, even when actually in the ring playing it. After the tag team with Matt Hardy split up, Vince McMahon personally gave Bray Wyatt the green light to begin production of the infrastructure needed for the Fiend character, and it did not take long for Bray Wyatt to start that ball rolling. However, Vince McMahon had a caveat. He specifically instructed Wyatt to get into shape. Sources within the production team state that Vince McMahon made all the right noises about pushing and using the character to Wyatt and the locker room, but he made it clear in meetings there were a lot of hoops to jump through, and the physique was something that Vince McMahon was very, very interested in, which I don't think surprises anyone to hear. As the puppets were being made for the Firefly Funhouse, the production team monitored the progress, and by that I don't just mean for the infrastructure. It was clear at all times that the plug could be pulled by members of the production team if Vince McMahon soured on the project ahead of time. Now, Vince McMahon held the production team back, saying that he was happy with Wyatt's physique and excited for the character. The debut and accompanying teasers were very popular with fans, and that certainly piqued Vince's interest, justifying his decision. The first problem came with the very first match. Bray Wyatt was not planning to open proceedings with a match against Finn Balor. SummerSlam, and indeed Balor, was selected by Vince McMahon, but it was not based on the timescale that Rotunda had himself laid out. It was opportunism and convenience. Balor's character was floundering on the main roster due to a lack of personality in the writing. This was of course something that Wyatt was himself familiar with. As I reported at the time, a full character reboot was coming for Finn Balor. SummerSlam would write him off TV, leaving the creative team to work out a new version of Balor that would excite fans again. The creative team would fail in this task, resulting in Triple H stepping in and asking Balor to return to NXT. First though, Balor had to be written off, and so The Fiend was called upon. At SummerSlam 2019, The Fiend debuted unfinished. Members of the locker room at the time have stated that Rotunda himself was thrilled with the debut and the presentation and felt that the character was delivering everything he wanted it to. Balor was defeated easily, and there would be opportunities in the future to show the invincibility that would become a trademark characteristic. This was something that Bray Wyatt wanted as a key part of the character, the relentlessness of the horror villain who would not stop chasing. Unfortunately, there were still issues with McMahon and the production team. McMahon wanted more from the physique, and he wanted the character to be less dark and more spooky and supernatural. We need to briefly discuss the fact that for the last 10 years, Vince McMahon has been looking for a replacement for The Undertaker, and Bray Wyatt is the individual that he'd identified to claim that position. McMahon had been a fan of the Wyatt family in NXT and had pushed them hard upon their call-up, but at no point did McMahon have confidence in Wyatt himself as a singles act. Despite wanting him to hold that mantle, McMahon wanted to make changes to the character to fit his vision, and there was always pushback on that. WWE management weren't very interested in the dark, horror-influenced elements of The Fiend. Instead, they wanted the dissociative identity disorder. They wanted the multiple personalities. They wanted the larger-than-life, the invincibility. They wanted the Undertaker one more time. If they could have pulled an urn out and strapped it to the man, they would have done. Talk about strapping a rocket, they wanted to strap an urn. The Fiend wouldn't wrestle again until October. Nobody seems to remember this particular pause, but there was a reason for it. The night after SummerSlam, I exclusively reported that The Fiend would be stepping straight into the main event and that some elements of the Fiend character would not appear very often. This would include the mask and the lantern, and so it proved. The Fiend character was protected and hidden. The writers took their lead from Wyatt himself, with McMahon going over everything with a fine-toothed comb. Early on, McMahon kept giving that thumbs up and saying, "You know what, Bray, you go for it." Only those two men knew what the plan was, and as it turned out, McMahon knew more than Wyatt did. The debut had gone very well. Fans in arenas all over the world were chanting, "Yowie wowie." Everything was going very close to perfectly. The only logical course of action for Vince McMahon was to make some changes. Wyatt was instructed once again to keep working on his physique. Meanwhile, Vince McMahon made the decision to have Wyatt bounce off his top babyface at the time, Universal Champion Seth Rollins. This, quite literally, the second match of The Fiend's career, was when things started to go very wrong indeed. The entire match took place under a red light that neither Wyatt nor Rollins was aware of ahead of time. Also not aware, the referee, or anyone in the audience who was struggling to see what was actually happening. The lighting was a Vince McMahon choice. It was a Kevin Dunn choice, to try and mask some of the more extreme elements of the character and try to add to the supernatural ones. This was a compromise with sponsors and networks who had questions. The concept of the match was to show that invincibility, leaving the crowd shell-shocked, stunned, lost in the moment. This Fiend cannot be killed. He'd maintain the chase, but the draft would end up separating them and the championship would elude him. This was the plan. As many of you undoubtedly are aware, it is not what happened. The fans did not react as Vince McMahon hoped. The fans turned on the match, rejecting the champion in favour of Wyatt. Now admittedly, Seth Rollins was not at the height of his babyface run, but certainly he was up there, and this was the end of it. The vignettes about the Firefly Funhouse had caught on. Wyatt has always been popular, but The Fiend was the last chance saloon, and fans knew this. The fans had persisted through the years of Bray Wyatt and his 30% win record. They wanted more, and they were going to fight for this one. They fought for Rusev Day and they lost. They fought for Becky and they won. They were ready to fight for the Fiend. So how did Vince respond? He gave the man the Universal Championship, and this was the worst decision he could possibly have made. This was not the plan. This was pure audible. There's a lot of negativity around the Rollins feud and a lot around how he would lose the championship, But not much is said about the actual championship reign. It was bad. This was due to a number of factors. The creative team struggled to write compelling storylines for a character that they did not understand. Wyatt encouraged the hiring and potential use of horror writers, but he was blocked at every turn. On top of that, the interference continued. Wyatt was yet to face an opponent that he himself had requested. He was yet to fight anyone on his individual list to go against. He was certainly happy wrestling the likes of Daniel Bryan, but it was not what he originally envisaged. The move to Fox was the beginning of the end for Wyatt, and this was just as they were getting started. The idea was to change the writing team, but this refresh was hamstrung. There were limitations to what they could show on TV, meaning that the horror elements were hidden until we got to pay-per-view shows. In the feud with The Miz, we got creepy rather than anything else. It wasn't exciting. It wasn't horrifying. It wasn't very fun to watch. At the same time, the fans had created a narrative. The Fiend changed people. This also was not the plan. This was a fan narrative brought to life that the writers were suddenly stuck with and didn't know what to do with. We also need to mention, at this point, that Wyatt had started to run out of people to work with. Established characters didn't want to follow the format of losing and then changing because they were happy with who they were, and wrestlers who were waiting for changes didn't have the most interesting stories going in. Certainly the feud with Finn Balor wasn't very hot outside of the debut. The Fiend didn't just beat people also, it buried them. Recovering from a feud with Bray Wyatt was extremely difficult, and having seen what happened to Seth Rollins, people were not excited to step into that ring. Goldberg, in fact, only chose to wrestle The Fiend if certain promises were made, for example, a victory and a championship run. Of course, this was discussed after the match was already announced. McMahon had made Wyatt his champion, but he did not show faith in his man. As the build to WrestleMania began, McMahon called another audible, giving Wyatt a single, clear instruction: lay down for Goldberg. In return, Wyatt would be provided one of the names on his list and one of his dream moments, the Firefly Funhouse match with John Cena, with Vince McMahon's full backing to do whatever he wanted. Finally, Wyatt had an opportunity. He could do the one thing that The Fiend was created for: bizarre, interesting horror stories. He accepted the offer easily and surrendered the championship to Goldberg without question. Promises, once again, were broken. The Fiend did not want the championship. The championship didn't fit The Fiend. Everyone involved had been bombarded with concepts for it, but the title just didn't work with the character. Why would he care about a trinket? They had tried to rebrand the championship with the Fiend's face. They tried to heighten different elements of the character, but none of it worked as intended. They didn't get the merch sales that they were hoping for. It wasn't a character designed for that. The belt also meant that a loss was coming, and this was not what The Fiend was all about. In the mind of Bray Wyatt, the belt was something to get rid of at the earliest opportunity. He personally had no issue taking the loss to Goldberg. But for the fans, this is the point at which the penny dropped. Vince McMahon had already lost interest in his latest toy. The Fiend Championship belt showed that what we were looking at was less of a serious character. And it was difficult for Bray Wyatt to take, given how he envisaged the character to begin with. The horror was dropping like a stone. McMahon had won. This was not Bray Wyatt's Fiend. The Firefly Funhouse match was a peak of the Fiend character, and also came during its decline. The match itself was easily the best received match that the character had, and possibly the best Wyatt match since the Shield versus the Wyatt family many years previous. It was also the first time that Wyatt had been given full license to perform as he intended. John Cena in particular championed every decision that Wyatt made. It was not the first time that he had done this with Bray. He wanted The Fiend in its ultimate form, and he made sure that management did as they were told. Cena got into many arguments backstage to fight for the cause. We would not have had that match without John Cena going for it. He never gave up, and it mattered. Additionally, at this point, a global disaster had struck. Knowing that the WWE was looking for a more cinematic style to compensate, Wyatt began to pitch storylines, but they were not popular with the creative team. The ideas of the creative team were not popular with Wyatt, and ultimately he only actually got one of the cinematic matches he was looking for in a period where they were crying out for it. Frustration mounted in every camp. Nobody was particularly happy with how things were developing. This is believed to be the time in which Wyndham Rotunda began to give up on wrestling. The failure of the Swamp fight hit hard. The involvement of Kevin Dunn had drastically altered the initial creative vision, leading some discussion backstage as to who to credit with the concept initially anyway, because it was so far removed from what Wyatt wanted. The inclusion of Alexa Bliss, designed to breathe new life into the character, actually ended up replacing it, as after being destroyed by Roman Reigns at SummerSlam and at Payback, The Fiend started to take time off. There were numerous reports, some more trustworthy than others, but what it actually came down to was a complete and total creative failure. Simply put, The Fiend that lost to Roman Reigns and Braun Strowman bore no resemblance at all to The Fiend that took on Finn Balor, and even less to The Fiend that took on John Cena. Ideas were pitched constantly, all of which took the character further and further away from the original vision of Wyndham Rotunda. He was not being given options for The Fiend. He was given options for what The Fiend would become. And if you watch the later matches of The Fiend, it was not something anywhere close to what he was looking for. McMahon himself was focused elsewhere, putting all of his attention into the evolution of the Tribal Chief and the push for Drew McIntyre. Wyatt rejected concept after concept after concept. Meanwhile, McMahon became suddenly unreachable. The creative and production teams at this point were losing patience. Wyatt was accused of being too protective of the character, of playing politics, or simply refusing to compromise. Randy Orton, another name on Wyatt's list, was the final gamble. This was the WWE conceding and allowing Wyatt himself to set the agenda. It would be only the second match that Wyatt actually wanted. Meanwhile, watching Alexa Bliss act in his stead, Wyatt recognised that what Vince McMahon wanted was not the same as Wyatt himself. What we saw in the feud of Randy Orton was simply the result of too many cooks spoiling the broth. Wyatt laid out what he wanted, and despite being promised it, he did not get it. Randy Orton argued Wyatt's case, as John Cena had previously, but this time was given lip service. By WrestleMania, when the match came around, when Wyatt was told on the day that he would no longer be winning, he had largely given up. When Bray Wyatt was eventually fired by the WWE, it was his third time on one of Nick Khan's cost-benefit analysis lists. WWE management had continually protected him. Vince still believed that Wyatt could be the next Undertaker. The problem was that nobody, including Wyatt himself, wanted that to happen. When the call came, Wyatt had been expecting it for some time, and by all accounts, he was done with wrestling. We haven't seen him since. Why? Well, why would he? A mountain of broken promises lay at Wyatt's feet. The WWE maintain, to this day, a stranglehold on the Fiend character, the character that Wyatt wants to play, and are entirely unwilling to surrender it. Bray Wyatt, the creator of the Fiend, is not permitted to use the Fiend character in any other media. Now, over a year later, finally, things have started to change. We are finally starting to see some development, some changes that could well bear fruit. If you're a regular here, this won't be news, but if not, let me tell you a secret. The WWE, under the creative direction of Triple H, have been in contact with Bray Wyatt once again. There is a battle ahead as to what promises to make and whether Bray Wyatt is willing to believe them. But the creative control that the Fiend longs for simply isn't an option anywhere else. A compromise will be required, but a compromise is certainly closer now than it has been in a long, long time. The question now, of course, is do you think the Fiend will return? How would you have done things better? Let me know in the comments, and if you want to know more about what's happening next for Bray Wyatt, check out the video on screen now. Subscribe for more as well, because I assure you there is a lot more coming.